At your service, sir. If I may, managing your money should not require terabytes of calculations. Allow me to present Simple Money Wins with Mr. Anthony Park.
Let's talk about first-time home buying in New York, and we're really going to focus on decision-making and negotiations. I'm talking with my good friend Maggie Ross. She's one of the top real estate agents in Brooklyn and Manhattan for over the past decade. And she's a little unusual in that she's not only an agent, but she's a fellow attorney. I don't believe you're practicing, but we both went to law school together. So I was able to see firsthand, how smart and hardworking and dependable Maggie is.
Thank you.
So Maggie, why don't we jump right into these questions to try to help out any young couples or families who are really hitting the first-time home buying process, yes?
Yeah, definitely.
So why don't we first talk about the decision-making process? I mean, the first decision folks are making is whether or not to buy, as opposed to, I suppose, renting. Can you talk a little bit about how folks should maybe approach that decision-making process?
Well, I can tell you how most people do approach it, which is a lot of people are what I call real estate hobbyists. And I think most people in New York City, well before they buy, start looking online at listings, usually on the aggregation sites, at, sort of dream listings, and I would love to live here someday. And then that kind of naturally evolves into using the rent versus buy calculator that you'll find online. The New York Times has been running that for years. And basically, I think as people sort of mature and maybe start making a little bit more in income, they decide whether they're going to plant roots and then do that assessment. And that's kind of how they generally come to the decision.
When somebody thinks it's about time to buy, how should they plan out their timing? I guess what I mean is, how far in advance should they start looking if they intend to close by a certain date? And I think the typical closing is they would want to close before the start of the school year or something like that, yeah?
Right. It really depends on kind of how impulsive the purchaser is, honestly. Some people are a lot pickier than other people. Most buyers walk in with a pretty extensive wish list, which I advocate. I think it's important to sort of shoot for the stars when you are investing in something as expensive and important as your home. And so if somebody comes in with a wish list of, let's say, 10 items, I always tell them, that's wonderful, but just be aware that you're probably not going to get more than 6 or 7 of those. Ideally it's as many as you can get, but some people are more particular, and that's just a personal and sort of stylistic aspect of personalities. But I would say for the average home buyer, if you're financing the purchase, you can kind of back up the date based on how long the bank is going to take. So you're looking at 60 days to close on your average property, condo, or co-op in New York City. That's how long the bank will take after you're in contract. So, if you're sort of average, I would say, and you really know what you want and you have your ducks in a row and you've been pre-approved by a lender, the entire process can certainly take less than 6 months. For some people, it takes 3. For some people, it takes, 2 years. But that's just because they spend more time looking.
From when, by the way, you mentioned something really great, the wish list, which I want to get back to. But just staying focused now on the timing. So we're talking about, on average, these are just averages, 6 months to get your financing finally approved. So backing that out from a closing date in August, let's say, you're going back to hopefully getting into contract, maybe sometime in June would be safe?
Right. So 60 days, you'd like to get into contract 60 days before you wish to close. August is a funny month because if you're buying a co-op, you're also looking at board interviews. And a lot of co-op board members are humans. And they go on vacation, just like, most people do in August. So I always find that August is a tricky date to get. And also mortgage lenders and attorneys, which I'm sure too. People tend to go away in August. So, but yeah, in general, it's 60 days. There's a little bit of seasonality. You have to kind of bump out holidays. You'll experience, delays if you're looking around the new year as well for the same reasons. But yeah, 60 days to actually close, a week to get into contract. And then I would say the average purchaser is looking for, a couple months, 3 months 4 months.
So you said a week to get into contract. So that's the time between when an offer is accepted or when negotiation begins and when the contract is signed.
So in New York, it's called, the brokers call it an attorney state. And what that means, it's different. There are other states like California, the brokers on the deal handle everything. There's no attorney involved at all, no closing attorney. And in those states, and I believe it's very common throughout the United States, the accepted offer is actually binding. In New York, that's not the case. So you can have an oral or a written accepted offer on a property, but it is not legally binding until your attorney performs their due diligence and you and the other party, the seller, fully execute, meaning you both sign the contract of sale. And that process, so from when you get the accepted offer, so that's post your broker helping you to negotiate the price and the seller and you coming to an agreement on that, post accepted offer, the contracts will go out, and it's generally expected that the contracts will be fully executed in 5 business days, so roughly a week.
So sticking to New York and maybe some of the surrounding areas, Connecticut, New Jersey.
Right.
Wouldn't other items beside price be entangled in the negotiations, say closing date or, I don't know, fixtures, inspection rules, things like that?
It depends. Sure. The biggest one is obviously price. When you're purchasing a house, so whether you're buying, a townhouse in New York City or you're buying, a house anywhere else, suburbs, upstate, Connecticut, wherever, you always do a home inspection. I suppose there are folks who skip that, but in general, you do a home inspection. When you're buying a condo or co-op, I would say that about 50% of buyers do the home inspection. There's simply less to inspect. You're not buying all of the mechanicals usually, like the boiler and the hot water heater. Those are building elements, right? So, but that in New York City, that's generally not a condition of the contract. That's something that the buyers do before they actually even sign the contract, so they can decide if they want to go forward. The home inspection is generally a condition outside of New York City. So yes, that would those items are negotiated, meaning you get the inspection, the deal, and we're talking about outside of New York City now. The deal is conditioned on the inspection, and then you and the seller will negotiate if there are items that come up in the inspection that need to be addressed, right? So it'll either be a cost credit or there will be items that are actually fixed, right? So other things that can be, sure, a closing date is, usually people don't bicker a lot about closing date. I've had that happen very few times. The parties usually express that up front, and then it's understood before they start negotiating on the other points like price. So that tends not to be a huge deal. I suppose if you want a closing date that's 6 months out, become more of a point of negotiation. And fixtures, I would say that falls under the same general rule. That's usually set forth up front. So the listing itself will say, hey, there's this antique chandelier in the dining room that's going to be replaced with something, quote unquote, cheap and cheerful from Lowe's because it's a family heirloom and it doesn't come with the house. Or, the air conditioners, are coming with me when I move or something like that.
Okay, speaking of air conditioners, you mentioned seasons before, how to sort of time things and understand that people are human beings, might be on vacation. Is there any element of timing to when to be on the market or when to try to purchase that would impact the prices? For example, I've heard that, buying in the winter or in the more blustery months might fetch you a better deal than if you buy in the summer where sort of everyone's looking. Is there any truth to that?
There's some truth to it. I mean, seasonality is very real in real estate. Spring and fall are when you have the highest inventory, and it's in that order as well. So in the spring, you'll find the most inventory on the market. We do the most transactions in the spring, generally speaking. It kind of depends what the market is doing too. I mean, there have been years, back, for example, during the crash, 2009, 2010, there was so much less seasonality because people, who needed to sell were just selling. Prices were a lot lower, and buyer motivation was really varied, and was just very specific to buyers. There were fewer patterns. But yeah, and as far as getting a deal, one thing I learned very early on in real estate is that, there's always, regardless of the market, regardless of the month and the season, people, this is real life stuff in addition to a transaction. So people always need to move. Some people always need to move. For example, your job can be transferred to Detroit, right? And you're out of New York City all of a sudden, and it's November. And in an ideal world, would you put your property on the market in November and sell it? No, probably not. But, in that situation, you may, and financially it may work for you. Maybe you have a relocation package, right, that includes some of the costs. So yes, I would say, like, painting in very broad strokes, you might get a better deal in the winter months, but I wouldn't always assume that because somebody has a property on the market off, quote unquote, off season, that you're actually going to get a better deal, because it doesn't always mean they're desperate. It might just mean that they're, pregnant with their third child and, need to move into a bigger place.
Thanks. That's actually one of those urban legends or myths that I've always wondered about, and I'm sure a lot of other folks would love to hear about. So thank you for that.
It's sometimes true. What's a better indicator of getting a deal is days on market. If you have, there are occasionally very stubborn, I guess I would say stubborn sellers, who have a sell price in mind, and they're not going to waver, right? And they can sit on the market for, 200 days, and the price is the price, right? That's rare. I've definitely met sellers like that, and frankly, kudos to them, because that takes a lot of chutzpah to stick with it, right? And to say, hey, the right thing will come along, and occasionally it does. But in general, a better indicator of getting a deal is if it's been on the market for a long time. If there have been price decreases, if you've seen 2 or 3 price decreases, you're probably at the bottom line. Most sellers aren't going to chop down 5 times. I suppose if the sky falls, right? Like the economy completely crashes, you'll see something different. But in general, those are the indicators of a property that you're likely to get a better deal on. It has less to do with, the season.
I want to circle back to something you talked about earlier about the wish lists. So, I mean, again, this talk, I'd like to focus on really some of the psychological and decision-making aspects of first-time home buying. And I'm pretty sure that,
right,
especially like with a young married couple, getting together on what are the key elements, the important deal-breaker elements or wish list items is a big deal. Can you talk about some of the major ones? I think the first one we need to start with, since we both live in New York, is city versus burbs, yeah?
Well, location, right? The broader topic of location, for sure. Yeah, I do think it's important. Most couples that I work with have, each person has their own wish list, right? Because we're individuals before we're couples, and it should be that way. But you do need, if you're purchasing together, regardless of, what the relationship is, if you're co-purchasing, you need to sync up. Because otherwise it's very frustrating, for you, So for sure, I mean, the items on the wish list tend to be location. So, broad geographic location like suburbs versus city is something obviously, first in line to iron out. After that, I would say, the type and size of outdoor space, or any outdoor space if you're in New York City, tends to be on a lot of people's wish list. Layout considerations, like, do you need an open concept kitchen? Is a galley okay for you? And that goes to a broader question too. Are you willing to do work, right? Is the fixer upper okay? Does it have to be brand new? I was more so in the city, but there are condos everywhere. Thinking about building amenities and what's important to you, if any. Those are the types of things that proximity to subway, right? Size, obviously, square footage, rough square footage, finishes, all of those types of things generally end up on the wish list.
What are, for folks who are not familiar, what are some examples of condo amenities? What does that mean?
Well, building amenities, condo or co-op, right? Does the building have a swimming pool, right? Some buildings have swimming pools.
Nice.
Yeah, for sure. Doorman is a really, common, wish or don't care, right? And your monthly cost will fall into line with the amenity package of the building. In other words, you're going to pay more in common charges or in monthly maintenance to a co-op if the building has more amenities. So, a lot of the new developments in New York are very amenity heavy. Like One Manhattan, I toured, a week or so ago down on the Lower East Side, and Yeah, I mean, they've got concierge service. They've got every type of child play area, room. I sound like I'm advertising for One Manhattan. I'm not.
You actually sound like I know you have young kids. You actually sound like you wish you could get into one of those.
I think there are perks. I don't live in a condo, but I think there are definite perks to that. It's a snowy day in New York City, and you've got a couple of kids, who are bored in the apartment, and having a child's lounge. There are buildings that have Wii rooms, golf simulators. It really depends on how much common space there is in the building. Parking, that's a really big one. As well as, is there on-site parking? Is there a gym? That's important to a lot of people. So, and common outdoor space too. So if and can you grill in the common outdoor space? You usually can't, but in some buildings you can. So yeah, those are the types of amenities that people look for. Although a lot of people don't care at all and say, why should I pay for amenities? I'm never going to use them. So, that's a personal call.
How often do you see pet friendliness as a factor in the decision making? Is that a big deal?
Yeah, it is. It's huge. I mean, people love their pets, and you should love your pets.
Sure.
Yeah, pet friendliness is a very big deal to a lot of buyers, and obviously, cats are generally speaking easier to place than dogs. Co-ops often have restrictions on dogs. Some co-ops don't allow dogs at all. Most co-ops just have, size and breed restrictions, or one or the other, right? But there are cases where co-op boards actually interview dogs.
Wait a second. Hold on. We need to stop right there. What did you just say, that the co-op board sometimes interview the dogs?
I would say sometimes. I've definitely heard of it. It's never in 10 years. It's never happened to me with one of my purchasers, thankfully. But yes, I have, in the history of New York real estate, dogs have definitely been interviewed by co-op boards.
So who is interviewing? Is it a board member, or is it another dog? I mean, how does that work even?
It should be another dog. You know what? I would not be surprised if they, the scenario I've heard of is, where there's a question, is this going to be a barker? Is this dog going to be, a menace, right, to the building, especially in a maybe more of a boutique building where, you have fewer neighbors and it's really, going to stand out. Or, that these are thin walls, what the construction is like in the building. You can already hear, your neighbor's television set. So if there's a barking dog, it's going to be a huge nuisance, right? And I've heard of just a couple of cases where dogs have been actually brought in front of the co-op board. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody brings another dog for them to interact with to see if they bark. Although I cannot confirm that that's actually happened.
I need to see a video of that. That would just be so funny.
You should. I'm sure somebody has to have that on YouTube. We'll look it up and post it afterwards.
So this might be a very New York-centric question, but again, coming back to amenities, and tell me if this applies to brownstones or non-condo buildings as well. But packages seems to be a bigger deal, what with Amazon taking over the world, right? So having a doorman to accept deliveries. Yeah, tell me how that's factoring in lately. Right.
People just want to know that they're going to get them, right? Most people. I mean, for some people, having a doorman is also a safety issue. Yeah, and a convenient. I mean, it's nice. Some people distinctly, I've had buyers who will not live in a doorman building because they find it very invasive to have somebody seeing them come and go, and what time they leave, and maybe what condition they come home in. So I've had that request at all price points. No way would I ever live in a doorman building. But in terms of packages, so one trend that, becomes somewhat popular over the past few years is also virtual doormen, where, some buildings, especially smaller boutiques, in an effort to, provide a way for packages to be delivered without actually staffing a person, therefore keeping the common charges a bit lower, because you're not paying for an actual staff and, all the associated costs of that. So, there are these companies that provide virtual doorman services. It should be door person services, that will, basically there's a code, and then the carriers can, somehow technologically, I don't really know how they who I suppose the UPS person has the code and the FedEx person has the code, and that's how it works. And then there's a locked room where packages are delivered so that they're not left out in the lobby for anybody to take. And then, of course, the owners all have access as well.
I kind of skipped over one of the bigger decision-making questions before we move on, and it has to do with schools. How does zoned schools factor into all this?
So zone schools are important to people with kids. I also find a lot of, obviously, if they plan to attend public schools, sometimes people, even without kids, will look at that as a factor for potential resale, right? If you're buying a, 2-bedroom or above in particular, retrading a product in a coveted school zone, eventually, looking to say sell in 5 years, maybe, you'll make more money if you're in a better school zone. As a caveat, brokers, there are fair housing rules, and we as brokers cannot steer buyers and, towards specific school zones at all as a matter of fair housing.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so I kind of have to stay out of it. You'll find, the aggregation sites will always list, what's the I think students says nearby school, right? And then, you should independently verify that on the Department of Education website. I honestly don't know what the rules are for brokers with respect to schools in other states. So if somebody's looking in, suburbs of, New Jersey or Connecticut or something, I can't tell you what the rules are around it. But here we have to be careful that, of course, if you have kids and you plan to put them in public school, that's a big factor. The noise, right? So, is the building next to a firehouse? Is that going to be an issue? Is there, I've had townhouse buyers, purchasing in a more sort of commercial area. And there's one great family, I've worked with for years, and they ended up purchasing a house that's next to a bar. And they were really worried about it. So they went, at different times of evening, nighttime, to kind of check out the noise. And it turned out that it wasn't loud, and they, in fact, got along really well with the owner, and they bought the house. So that's part of, parcel of the location talk is also noise.
Coming back to schools just for 1 second, are brokers allowed to discuss it at all? Do you just send them to a website? Do you send them to resources beyond the Department of Education? What are you allowed to say?
So, yeah, I mean, you'll find in listings, that disclosing that it is zoned for X, right? Like zoned for, in Brooklyn, PS 321 or PS 29 or PS 58. These are some of the ones that, I hear parents asking me about a lot, right? Or maybe a school that they don't know much about, right? So disclosing what the zoning is, that I believe is street legal. What's not okay is saying, oh, you should really look in, PS 321, or you should really try to buy something, in district X, Y, or Z. So what I do is I refer people, first off, the Department of Education website is where you independently verify what the zone is. You should also know that schools are rezoned periodically in the city, so that and schools reach capacity. So the fact that you are in a specific zone doesn't necessarily mean you get in. That's not meant to scare anyone, because I believe that you normally do. And this is, also not my area of specialty, but that's, it's a consideration that you should independently research if it's something that's important to you. So the DOE website, there's a website called Inside Schools that's really useful that I refer buyers to as well, that, rates, and they have like parent ratings about schools. I'm a parent too, and, purchased property and have gone through it myself. So I found that website really helpful. And then there are school consultants that people pay to sit down with, or you can go to lectures. They exist in both Manhattan and Brooklyn. I'm sure in other boroughs. I don't know the characters in that space, in say Bronx, Queens, or Staten Island. But, there are folks who specialize exactly in this area. That's their job, is to educate parents about the public school system. In New York City, it can be confusing and daunting.
And just to wrap that up, we're talking about schools not only for making sure that your kids get the best and safest possible education, but this does have a potential impact on resale value later on, especially if it's a larger family-sized type unit or property, because you'll have a broader number of potential buyers or eager buyers if the place that you're selling is in a good school zone. Is that about right?
Yes. I mean, generally speaking, yes. I wouldn't put all my eggs in that basket. At a certain, I met with a school consultant in Brooklyn a few years ago, and one of the takeaways, because this is what a lot of parents go to school consultants about. They're looking for property and they say, okay, I really want to drill down and figure out, strategically how to get my kid into the best school and move somewhere where the zoned, middle schools, looking forward years and years, are also very good. And one of the takeaways, I had was at a certain point, you buy a property that you like, and you can, in New York, there's so many charters and, different types of schools. And it's, maybe you're gifted and talented, or maybe you have special needs, and you qualify for other schools. So there are kind of no guarantees around it. But yeah, I mean, again, painting in kind of broad strokes, sure. If you're in a coveted district and your property is not rezoned, as part of a school rezoning, then that's definitely a good thing for resale.
You mentioned, that you don't give financial advice, but of course, but I would like to just generally at a high level talk about for a first time budgets and how to sort of financially prepare for purchasing your first home. Can you just give us some real high level rules of thumbs, or just think of someone who's never done this before? Like, what is a down payment? What amount should they be preparing, and what monthlies should they look out for? Post closing costs, what should they be thinking about? Things like that.
Okay, so so I provide all of my purchasers with, a lot of this is helpful to just having written form. The purchasers I work with get buyer 101 email from me when we start working together. That sets forth the process, and then I also provide written materials about closing costs. So really, in general, it's best to have 20% to put down. You don't need to. In co-ops, generally 20%. Sometimes it's more. I'm selling a co-op right now where the minimum is 30% down.
Let me just jump in and make sure that everyone understands. 20%, we're talking about a percentage of the purchase price. So for a $500,000 unit, 20% would be $100,000. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah. So 20% down of the purchase price is called a conforming loan. And that just means that when you borrow money from the bank, so when you get your mortgage, the costs associated with that loan are lower if it's a conforming loan, if it falls under like Fannie Mae conforming loan guidelines. If you're borrowing 90%, so in other words, you're putting 10% down of the purchase price, or on a $500,000 purchase, you're putting down $50,000, right? You're paying something called PMI, which is mortgage insurance monthly. This is stuff that you want to, this is why really the first step, if you plan to finance a purchase, is to speak to a loan officer, at either an institutional lender, like a household name bank, Chase Citibank, whomever, Wells Fargo, or go to a mortgage broker, and your real estate broker can guide you. And we all work with these folks regularly and have professional relationships. Like my mortgage lender is the best. But I send that, and truthfully, I mean, the person I use is awesome. But so you go to the mortgage lender because this is something really important to iron out up front, so that when you're looking and when you're enjoying, looking at all of these listings on StreetEasy and, the New York Times or whatever, at lunchtime at your desk, at your office, that you're being realistic. You don't want to overshoot, and you don't want to cheat yourself too. You want to look within budget. So in general, 20% down is going to make the loan product cheaper. It's overall a better way to go. There are some instances when 10% down works really, really well. Again, that's a loan officer question. You also want to have what's called post-closing liquidity, which means that after all the closing costs are paid, after you put your 20% down, you need, first off, the bank is going to require a certain amount of post-closing liquidity to approve you for the mortgage. Second, the building. So if you're buying in particular in a co-op, they're going to look for, X number of months, and there's generally no published formula for this, but really they're looking for 2 years. Some buildings, a year is okay, but I try to get buyers to have 2 years of maintenance and mortgage payments in the bank post-closing. That's one of the things that co-op boards look for. Most co-op boards look for. And again, it's usually not a published formula. but you want to have post-closing liquidity. If you're buying a house or if you're buying a condo, you're really looking to the bank requirements for post-closing liquidity that determine whether they'll lend you the money.
Is the bank requirement going to be similar to the co-ops? Is it going to be in that 1 to 2 year range, or is it generally more strict or less strict?
It really depends. And the trick with this is that also co-ops don't, again, they don't publish. So I can't tell you, this building wants to see 2 years. In some buildings will publish it and they'll tell you exactly what they want, but most of them don't. So as a broker, you try to go, a little bit conservative because you want your buyer to pass the board. I've had cases where I put buyers in front of a board with, a year. Sometimes, if you're a little thin, some buildings will ask you to escrow maintenance, and sometimes if you're a little thin going in, you can say, with this board application, if the co-op requires, I would be happy to put a year of maintenance up front to reassure you that I have enough in, post-closing liquidity. There are ways around, but yeah, that's so 20% down, some amount of post-closing liquidity, depending on what you're buying and what the bank requires, and then closing costs, which is the big piece of the puzzle. I would say this is the one financial area that first-time home buyers are, in New York City, their jaws often drop when they realize what closing costs they're in for, second, third time around the rodeo, when you've bought and sold before, it's less daunting, but it's, it does add up.
So talk about that. You're teasing us. What are these closing costs?
Yeah. So, if you buy a new development, it's pretty similar. If you're buying a condo, your closing costs are higher than if you're buying a co-op. If you are buying a townhouse, they're also a little bit lower, but you're basically paying closing costs that include taxes and then bank fees. Bank fees are the really big ones. So in New York, we have something called mortgage recording tax, which is approximately 2% of the value of the loan. You're paying that on the way in. It's an argument to put as much down as you can, too, right? Another argument against doing 10%, and really shooting to save up for that 20% if it's within your means. So you pay approximately 2% in mortgage recording costs. This is stuff also the bank gives you a good faith estimate of closing costs up front, and you should ask your loan officer when you get your pre-approval for that good faith estimate of closing costs, because it's just extraordinarily helpful in looking for stuff that you can actually afford, right?
So I want to put some numbers on this because I'm sure this is hard to follow for somebody who's a first timer to all this. So let's use an example of $1 million listing, just because it's a nice round number, and our buyer is putting 20% down, which is $200,000. That means they're taking out an $800,000 loan, and 2% of that $800,000, the mortgage recording tax, is $16,000. Is this $16,000 something that's sort of folded into the mortgage, or is that something our buyers have to come up with as cash at the closing table?
You're paying that up front. So your closing costs are paid up front. If you are buying, so there are a few others. If you're buying a property, this is one that everybody finds laughable because of the terminology, but if you're buying a property that's $1 million or more in New York City, you also pay mansion tax. And we all know that when you purchase something for $1 million in New York City, it's certainly not a mansion. But that's 1% of. So if you're buying $1 million property, and this isn't paid to the bank, this is paid in tax to the city. You pay 1% of the purchase price in mansion tax. So $1 million purchase, you're paying 10, in tax.
So would it be fair to say that if a young couple is preparing to purchase, they shouldn't really think, I have 20%, I need 20%. Would it be fair to say they need something more like 23% or 24% because they need 20 of that for the actual down payment and a couple of other points to cover all these other closing costs? Does that sound about right?
Sure. Well, there are a couple other caveats, right? Because it depends what you're buying. So if you're buying in a new development condo, there's something called a sponsor in New York, right? So a sponsor is either it's the entity or person who converted a building. So it's in a co-op, it's the entity that converted the building into a co-op, even if that happened, 40 years ago. Sometimes those owners, called sponsors, retain units in the co-op. If you buy from them, you are, and it's the same same type of purchase in terms of closing costs as if you're buying in a new development condo where the sponsor is the developer who developed the building, right? Who built the building. So when you're buying as the first purchaser, right, from whenever this building was built or converted, you are also paying transfer tax. Typically, transfer tax is paid by the seller in a resale property, but when you're buying from a sponsor, you as the purchaser are paying transfer tax, and that is over $500,000 purchase is 1.825% of the purchase price, and that's in tax combined to the city and state. If it's under 500, it's like 1.4 or 1.45%. So that's an additional, it does add up. So if you're buying it and your loan officer will go through this with you as well when you get the pre-approval. If you're interested in new development, you definitely need to have more cash on hand for closing, significantly more.
That's not even including what you need to have in the bank afterwards for post-closing liquidity, both for the bank, for the condo co-op board, or even just for your own peace of mind, your own savings plans.
Which is why I'm also, I'm not going to advocate a strict number, right? So 20%, I can say, yes, you should have 20% down so that you have a conforming loan and you're not paying PMI if you can. I've done plenty of deals. I mean, there are all sorts of loan products, right? Like there are FHA loans, which is, and then there are, other types of loans that are issued privately. But like an FHA loan, which has to do with where the property that you're purchasing is, some buildings are eligible for FHA loans and you can put 3 to 5% down on an FHA loan, right? And you are paying PMI. But back in the crash, 2010, I sold a bunch of FHA products. They were really popular because people were stretched. They were like, I know the market tanked and I'm going to stretch, because I know I'm getting a deal. And it frankly really worked out for a lot of those buyers. So there are circumstances under which a lower percentage is fine, but because I don't want to just paint in really broad strokes and just say, okay, 30% down. That's what you should have, to feel comfortable, because it's not necessarily true. In an ideal world, you want to have 20% down plus your closing costs plus liquidity.
Wow, a lot of numbers. That's the kind of stuff you don't really find on the internet or on Google. So that's just gold for somebody who needs to really drill down and figure out what they're doing as a first-time homebuyer. So that's really great.
Well, you have to realize too, I mean, like any industry, everybody who's working for you in the process wants you to buy because it's what we do for a living, right? And it's that brings up a much broader topic, just, sort of about, I suppose, people's different professional styles. For example, I'm not pushy because it's not my way, right? I consider myself part therapist, part real estate broker, with a little law, sprinkled in there. Although I, certainly don't wear that hat on the real estate transactions. But so there are ways to accomplish anything, right? You can come in, again, an FHA product. Those are, I would say harder to find these days, but you could have a total of 10% down, and maybe accomplish a purchase. Would I advocate that? No, not really. So it is important. It's important to have a team around you, who you feel is, reliable and you can trust. You certainly want, a good real estate broker. You want to have a good attorney, and you want to have a really top-notch mortgage loan officer as well.
That's a perfect transition, because the next area I wanted to ask you about was about how to work with a great, and I want to be specific, buyer side real estate broker, because the industry is sort of bifurcated or there's two different roles on every transaction. And, how do you find representation who is really going to be great for you as a buyer, and especially as a first-time home buyer?
Right. Well, you just call me. I mean, but no, so not every deal has two brokers, right? You do not have to use a buyer's agent. You're under no obligation in New York, and you'll get an agency disclosure form from your real estate broker when you start working with them that explains the fiduciary duties of the brokers. You can also look it up online. And it's called an agency disclosure form. And you really, that's informative. It reads a little legal. So just to kind of break down the roles though, you need not use a buyer's agent, but it's certainly really, really useful, especially for first-time home buyers. I find it's useful, though, even for folks who have, bought and sold 3-4 times. How do you find them? I'm word of mouth. So, some brokers do a lot of advertising, and are really heavy. And, other brokers are, you can go on the website, there are all sorts of, technological ways, right? You can look in your Facebook friends or, however you go about finding recommendations for any kind of service professional in your life.
What are some red flags? So let's say a friend recommends somebody to you, or you find somebody online, you meet with them or you chat with them. What are some things that might pop up that would be a warning sign? I don't want to make it sound so insidious, but just something that you might think, hey, maybe this gentleman or this lady is maybe more focused on sell side deals or buy side deals, or or is not focused on this neighborhood. What are some things that first time home buyers should look out for?
Okay, I'm going to challenge one of your assumptions, which is that brokers tend to work one or the other, because an awful lot of brokers, myself included, I would say I work slightly more sell side deals than buy side deals, but it kind of depends on the marketplace. And I've really kind of done 50-50 for most of my career. Yeah. So it's not, and most of the, successful brokers work both, right? So a lot of brokers have teams, and sometimes duties are split up. There are, dedicated buyers agents on, within a team. But sometimes it's just an individual broker, or maybe a broker plus an assistant, but I work both, and most brokers I know also work both. So I don't think it's broken so much into specialty on that, from that perspective. Red flags, I mean, honestly, this is sort of a boring answer. I think chemistry matters, and just general chemistry. And you can usually, it's like anything in life, right? You can sort of get a sense within, what is the psychological, is it like within 10 seconds or a minute or something of meeting somebody, you kind of know whether you're going to hire them or whether you like them, or, whether they really rub you the wrong way. So get on the phone with them. A lot of people prefer email, you're busy at work, whatever, but make the time, do it's just a 10-15 minute phone call, ask some questions, see if, it's all making sense to you. That's number one, I would say, is chemistry. Except, my broker friends will not enjoy this answer, but accessibility is really big. I've found, and this is no diss to my, colleagues in other regions, but I found I've, worked on and purchased property upstate New York, right, where I'm from. And, it's a different response time in general. I would say that I received from brokers. The urgency doesn't feel, it just doesn't feel like they're working quite the same hours, maybe, or as, just attached to their phone. Honestly, it's a very, very full-time job. And, there were days when I used to answer literally every email within minutes, and it could be midnight or it could be 7 a.m. and I could be on vacation. And
Maggie, come on. That's crazy.
No, that's awesome for the client, but you don't have to do that as a broker, but you don't want somebody who, in New York real estate time, you don't want somebody who's going to blow you off for 2 days, because real stuff happens, Oh,
especially mid-negotiation. Yeah.
Totally. I mean, in negotiation or in general, I feel like a fair expectation of a response the same day. It's a pretty fast-paced industry, To that point, everybody is, we mentioned this before, everybody's a human, co-op boards are human, composed of human beings, and everybody's a human. Real estate brokers also go on vacation, but they should have coverage, right? So you just, like any professional, you want to make sure that they're reliable and responsive. So that, I would say, is another red flag. And then I wouldn't discount people who are new. Some of the most eager brokers that I've, done deals with over the years have been new, newer agents, right? So I wouldn't say just because somebody has, 20 years of experience that they're better at the job. Yeah, they know what they're talking about, that they can inform you, we're not loan officers, we're not financial planners, we are not tax advisors, but, sort of like the conversation that we've had about these topics, some understanding of the pieces that go into a purchase, those are things you should be looking for.
I think we're coming up against the amount of time we have, so this will be the last line of questions. And again, thanks for sharing all this really great kind of pro tips for...
Can I flip that question on you first? What do you think? Because you've worked with a lot of brokers in your life too. What do you find as the red flags?
I hear a lot of things that I'm supposed to look out for, but I'm just not sure. I don't think I have enough volume of transactions to have drawn conclusions. For example, the issue of the broker who lives in or is on the board of a building, right? I've kind of had experiences that have been good and bad, so I don't know where I fall on that. Where the good would be, they're super friendly with the board. They're just nice people in general, which always matters, of course. And that can't hurt you with your board application if your representation is on the board, right? Or at least knows everybody in the board. I'm sure they have to recuse themselves or something like that. But on the other side, it sometimes turns out to be some kind of sort of entrenched person who maybe gets a little not as working as hard because they sort of suck up every deal that goes to that building. I've seen that happen before. That hasn't been a great experience. So
I've also seen people who the board doesn't like. The resident broker becomes disliked, by the board. And it's common. And I'm certainly not throwing, quote unquote resident brokers under the bus, but that happens too. So yeah, I don't think that's always the way to go. Interesting. You're still forming your opinion.
Yeah, and I agree with your statement about don't judge based on years of experience necessarily. I mean, you don't want somebody who's completely new because there is a lot of moving parts on any deal. But a younger, less experienced broker, again, not completely inexperienced, but may have more energy or a better feel for where trends are going than somebody who's maybe towards the end of their career or just kind of burnt out. It really depends on where that person is in their life stage and how it matches up with what you're trying to do. That's been my experience, at least.
And maybe with what they did before, because most people come to real estate as a second or third career too, right? So for me, I practice law. A lot of my colleagues and some of the best brokers I've worked with came from retail backgrounds too. So you never know.
One of my friends is an extra, meaning her main source of income is to be a background actor on movie sets or TV shows.
Uh-huh.
And she does the real estate whenever there's, she's in between movies, which is kind of a cool life to live in New York.
Yeah. That's, I wonder how she balances when she's in a show, though. She must have some kind of, backup help because, again, it's like the response time. Yeah. Interesting.
All right. So the last area that I think a lot of first-time home buyers need a lot of help on, actually, is the offer and negotiations. So where does their buyer's broker fit into that part of the process? So they found the house that they love or the property that they love or they think they love. Tell me how much your broker should be involved in that part and just walk me through that, please.
Well, the broker is the mouthpiece, right? So the broker is the person who negotiates the deal for you fully, right? The buyer and seller don't have contact unless nobody's represented, right? It's a homeowner selling credit, and I do not recommend that anybody engage in a transaction like that because most of the time it's a mess.
But let's be specific about that because that's common knowledge, but it's not really delved into a lot. Why is it? Let's give an example of why it's a bad idea for a buyer and seller to have direct contact with each other, or one with so forth. Yeah.
Right. Well, most people want a buffer, because transmitting information, it's a very rare personality trait to be so cool, and so cool is maybe, I'm sort of searching for the right word for it, just so even keeled and diplomatic, because real estate transactions are kind of emotional, right? It's for most people, especially for some home buyers, it's often the biggest financial investment you've ever made in your life. And, the double whammy is also where you're going to live, potentially with your family, right? Or even just yourself, right? And your dog or, whomever, but it's your home, So it's a really big emotionally weighted transaction. Not having a buffer in that situation is generally a bad idea. You don't want to have direct contact because it can get emotionally charged, especially if you tend toward that as a human, right? Which not everybody does, but even if you're like some of the biggest kind of know-it-alls, I'm allowed to say this because I'm a lawyer, but some of the biggest know-it-all buyers that I've ever dealt with are lawyers. And lawyers and people who are in finance, tend to be, and this is no diss to anybody, but, tend to think, okay, I can do this myself. But then when really faced with it, there is, and this sounds stupid, but there's kind of an art to this type of transaction. And, it's a lot of things can go wrong. If you don't have professionals representing you, you may not know certain questions to ask. How about that inspection? Maybe the seller is, in sales themselves of some, shape or form in a, different industry, but they're really, great at, convincing you, oh yeah, it feels so familial. It's like, yeah, there's some radon in the basement. Like, no, I don't have to do anything, and you're like, oh, okay, cool. It's going to cost me a couple $100. So it's something that they should actually fix, right? That's I guess the best example I can give on that point.
The best example I can tell me if this sounds right to you is when you're negotiating the price, because if it's a buyer directly offering a price below ask to a seller, there's a good chance that's not done artfully enough, because the seller you're basically saying, hey guy, the house that you lived in the past 20 years, I think it's worth less than you do, and that needs to be done very delicately, right. I would say. The house that you love and you raise your children in,
100%. That's and that's what I mean by the buffer. You want to have somebody presenting a number, and frankly, numbers are numbers, and it is at the end of the day, even though it's emotionally charged, and you will get help, and everybody loves the happiness of walking into a new home and knowing you've accomplished this great thing. It is a business deal, and so having somebody run that for you for price, for sure. An offer is not an emotional expression, and sometimes sellers really do take it there and insult it. Oh, that was too low. The other reason, to have a buyer's agent is the relationships, right? So, I call it in New York City, I call it my campus. But I know, we're like in the real estate world, any listing, I know most of the brokers, and I've worked with them, being in this for 10 years, certainly in Brooklyn, I know the cast of characters. I've done deals with, the lion's share of these people who have been around for a long time. And so that helps, like in any industry, just having somebody who's, who knows the cast of characters, and they can say, oh, this, person tends to deal in this way. We'll give lots of information. This person doesn't give much information. Don't take it as a sign. They're just quiet. I mean, whatever the case is. But it's really helpful to have somebody representing you who has those relationships.
That's great. Sort of, I guess, almost inside information, just knowing all the parties involved. Yeah.
Right. Well, so to your question about the negotiation on price. So the broker is the mouthpiece, and they should advise you, right? And we'll look at things like the days on market, the existence of other offers. Your broker, if they're worth their salt, is always going to ask the seller's agent, hey, do you have other offers on this property? That tells you, A, how quickly you need to act if you want it, and B, they'll usually give some, a tidbit of information. They can't tell you, shop. It's called shopping offers. They're not performing a fiduciary duty to the seller if they tell you, oh yeah, somebody offered $495, right? I have a bid for $495 and a bid for $493. That's not how it works. But they could say, hey, I have something really close to ask. And if you know them, the brokers know each other, and they know this person to be a, honorable broker who wants to get a deal done, then, you have some information that's going to help you craft your offer.
I just want to get into specifics for somebody, again, who's never done this before. If they're in love with a house at $1 million that's listed, meaning the asking price is $1 million, what's the next step? Do they come to you and ask you, how should we do our first bid? Or do they usually come to you with their first bid and you are just sort of executing and delivering communications? Or does it kind of depend?
Well, usually they're not coming to you then at all, because they've been working with you. Sometimes people will come, but okay, so they've been working with you for a little while, and a property has been identified. That the ask price is, say, $1 million, and then usually the buyers come to me and say, what do you recommend I bid? And by that point, we already know what their budget is. We know what they can afford. There's a real difference between willingness and ability for people that I like to respect, right? and it has to do with what a specific property is worth to them, and what they're willing to pay for it. So you shouldn't feel pushed. But you also, sometimes people surprise themselves too, because this happens kind of a lot. People will fall in love with a property and it's a little bit over their budget, and they'll say, okay, I really didn't want to spend that, but I'm going to make it work because this is so perfect. That happens, and you shouldn't feel pushed. But yes, they come to me, and then I give them a recommendation on where I think they ought to come in on a bid. And then, we talk about it. It's ultimately the buyer's choice, right? If I don't, in most cases, a real lowball offer is not met with a counter. So you want to engage the seller. And again, like you were mentioning before, you don't want to insult the seller. But there are circumstances under which maybe, testing the waters and coming in lower is appropriate. The broker should help you with that. And then ultimately the choice is yours, where you as the buyer direct the broker as to, what you want to bid.
Do you often get very data-driven clients who ask you for comparables and similar listings in the building to support your recommendations? Does that happen to you, especially with all the financiers here in New York? Yes,
that happens a lot. And also because there's just so much data now too, right? So, all of this information is, the aggregation sites, are pulling together all of this data. So it's all transparent, so the folks who are looking at this stuff at, lunchtime at their desk in their office, they kind of have access. So I'm regularly asked to summarize, and often not even asked. It's just something we do. Another sign of, a broker who kind of knows what they're doing is to say, okay, this is, X unit, 10A sold for, $1.2 million 3 months ago, and we see that it closed for that number. This is the mirror image of that, or this is the same apartment, but it's 2 floors lower with an older kitchen. So I think we ought to bid X, right? That kind of information is definitely comes into play.
Maggie, I have so many other questions, and I'm sure it would be just super valuable, but I want to be respectful of your time. Maybe we could do this again sometime. Thanks again, Maggie, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again.
Okay. Thanks so much, Anthony. Bye.
Thank you for listening, sir. Shall I add you to the Park Industries Central Database? Just go to anthonyspark.com to join our email newsletter. Good day, sir.